Welcome to our podcast series of Coffee with a Cord, where we discuss various peace and security related topics, including ongoing and emerging conflicts in Africa, policy developments, evolving theories, and innovative approaches to peace and security. Our guests are conflict resolution practitioners, experienced mediators, and policymakers within the peace and security landscape. Enjoy this episode and feel free to leave your comments. Coffee with a Cord is published by the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes. The views and opinions expressed in this production do not reflect the views of Accord and its affiliates.
Good day. Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Accord. I am Savannah Wilmot, and I am delighted to be speaking to Nirina Kiplagat today. Nirina is the Regional Peacebuilding Advisor to the UNDP Regional Service Centre, which includes managing the Africa Regional Project for the prevention and response to violent extremism. Today's episode will help unpack the patterns of violent extremism in Africa and how this is affecting youth in particular. But before we dive into it, please grab a cup of coffee and enjoy the short animated video that will help contextualize today's discussion. Welcome back. Nirina, it is such an honor to be able to converse with you once again on such a topical and timely issue. Just to start, Nirina, we would like to know a little bit more about yourself. What led you to where you are today?
Thank you, Savannah. To start off with, just to go a little bit into my background, and I grew up in Kenya and was quite aware in terms of the conflict dynamics within the sub-region, and looking at what was happening in Uganda, Somalia, Sudan, now South Sudan and Sudan, also looking further afield, at Mozambique, and considering the role that also Kenya has played within these peace processes, being quite aware of the importance of mediation, the importance, of inclusion, of coming together. So I would say this is where the seed was initially planted in terms of an interest in the topic. In university, I studied history and social cultural anthropology, and then went and did an internship at an organization in their conflict resolution program. And what I found particularly interesting within this internship was that a lot of the skills which we were seeing were important in terms of awareness raising, in terms of be it prejudice, active listening, how to practice that, how to resolve conflicts on an interpersonal level, were the same types of skills that were used at a national and international level. Looking at how culture came into play, psychology, how is the room set up, who is part of the conversation. And that triggered in me, more of an interest to then delve in deeper into the topic. And I did the Masters of Science in Conflict Analysis and Resolution, which was extremely practical, also mediation training, looking at cultural considerations. And from there went into first civil society work, so very much focused on local level peace building. Also worked in organizations looking at more advocacy work. And then finally in UNDP, where I've been for 14 years, working on different aspects of conflict prevention, sustaining peace, and most recently in the last few years, really focusing on prevention and response to violent extremism.
Thank you, Nirina. I always find it fascinating to hear sort of the human story and the human journey that leads people such as yourself to the space that you're in. It's especially inspiring, I think, for someone, a young person like me. So thank you for a bit of that background. And I suppose just to frame the discussion for today, we'd like to start with the basic. What is violent extremism, and what sort of patterns are you seeing when it comes to its occurrence?
The most important aspect to mention right off the bat is that there isn't an agreed definition of violent extremism. What we see in the 2015 United Nations Plan of Action is that it considers and addresses violent extremism as and when conducive to terrorism. In the Africa region, we have a regional project and we have a working definition in order to have particular parameters and to be clear in terms of what we're working on. And so within the project, we consider violent extremism when a group of persons express their ideology through violence or advocate for violence in order to obtain their objective. So in this case, I think what's also very important, is to not conflate violent extremism with other types of armed conflict or opposition or local level insurgencies. So having also that ideological element is part of what we focus on in the Africa region. In terms of seeing it occur, we have really seen a change, I would say, in terms of the last 6 years. And in terms of the spread, when we started implementing the project in 2016, it was predominantly focused on West and East Africa. If you look at areas, dominated by Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. What we have certainly seen is a spread, and a spread to the West Africa littoral states. We've seen a spread to Southern Africa, which has gotten a lot of attention recently. Also a spread, into Central Africa and, the Great Lakes region more specifically. What I think is very important is that what this has shown, often when we see the manifestation of violent extremism, there has been a process. It isn't immediate. So I think there's been more of an awareness in terms of what do these risk factors actually look like. And, within that frame, also more of an awareness of the importance of good analysis and the importance of really early prevention type of work premised on the analysis.
Thank you, Nirina. I suppose you're talking about the spread of violent extremism across the continent, and I keep thinking to myself, we're a young continent. Our youth population is expanding exponentially, and I'd like to know, how is violent extremism impacting youth in particular? You started to allude to the risk factors in your last answer, but I'd like to know, what are the lead push and pull factors driving recruitment of youth into extremist groups?
Thanks, Savannah, for that question in terms of, diving deeper into, more of the youth factor. And indeed, when talking about the risks, Sub-Saharan Africa has become the epicenter of violent extremism in 2022. We've had the highest number of deaths, in terms of a sub-region, 48% of all terrorist deaths are in Sub-Saharan Africa in 2021. The data suggests really that youth are more vulnerable to recruitment by coercive means and also more deliberately targeted by violent extremist groups. We've also seen a trend in recent research which we have undertaken, that there's also been more of a targeting of children to be part of these violent extremist groups, and also an increase, in terms of women or young women joining, but particularly as forced recruits rather than voluntary recruits. So certainly we see that, young people are in a way most affected in terms of the direct engagement with these groups as being targets. The particular risk age is really between 17, to 26 years old. And we have seen that in terms of the speed of joining from voluntary recruits, it takes from a month to 1 year of 80% of those who have voluntarily joined. when we looked at the factors, the economic factors, employment remains the most cited reason of why individuals join these groups. What is also interesting is in some recent research, that we have done, we've also seen that disillusionment with the group and seeing that those economic opportunities have not been met as they were perceived is also a factor of why they exit. We also look at, young people citing religious reasons, for joining. We have half of voluntary recruits citing religious reasons. However, more than half of that number have little to no understanding of the religious texts. But it's often, feeling an element of threat to different types of identity, factors, which also plays quite a role in this. So those I would say, are the most, prevalent, sort of factors. We also look at the issues of trust, and the majority, again, of voluntary recruits have little to no trust in government and security forces, but they do tend to be from more of these marginalized borderland areas. The other element is human rights abuses, particularly by security forces, which plays, quite a role. And the last point is also lack of exposure. And, we find in terms of influences, those that have less contact with other communities, for example, have less diverse perspectives, tend to be more vulnerable to recruitment.
Thank you, Nirina. That is certainly a lot of food for thought. And I suppose I'm just wondering, in the mix of all that, what role does frameworks and policies play when it comes to countering violent extremism, or how effective are they if one of the drivers might be a mistrust in a national government?
Frameworks and policies, I think, are important in terms of creating an enabling environment. And we've seen since 2016 with the UN Secretary General's action plan that really promotes a whole of government, a whole of society approach, really trying to address underlying structural factors. And even based on that, we can see that it needs to be more of a concerted effort. We have a mix in terms of the countries that we support, some that have national strategies and action plans, those that don't. We've also supported sub-regional action plans and strategies. And certainly the advantage, I'd say, number one, in terms of also the regional perspective, is that this is not an issue that's confined to one country. And having more of this broad transnational view, sub-regional view, regional view is very important also in terms of analysis, complementarity of approaches. As we've often seen in cases where there have been very robust mechanisms in one country, we've seen patterns of movement of groups of recruitment and risk to more neighboring countries. So certainly seeing, the advantage there. As I mentioned in terms of the holistic approaches, a lot of our work that we do is focused on supporting area-based work. And just to zero in terms of engagement with youth, for example, it's looking at economic and livelihood opportunities coupled with mentorship, leadership, elements of inclusion within the community, promotion of dialogue platforms, trust building, which you mentioned. So having particular initiatives in terms of particularly engagement with, for example, community police and youth in at-risk areas, social cohesion initiatives, and also looking at strengthening local governance, including this lens of prevention of violent extremism within policies and, also plans at the local level. And what we have seen is also trust, more in community leaders. So how to better, leverage upon that. But in order to have more of this integrated, cohesive approach, certainly having these policies and action plans is important. Mechanisms then are set up to support their implementation, and then also having monitoring mechanisms. I've alluded to it, but just to also emphasize that now there's also more of a focus on having subnational plans, and these tend to be more context specific. So we have, some good examples where there are, for example, county action plans in Kenya, and there's also more traction within this direction so that it can be quite contextualized to the sub-region.
No, thank you, Nirina. And I think what you're touching on there is quite an important part of the bigger conversation on the continent at the moment, especially with regards to youth and, of course, the Continental Framework for Youth, Peace and Security. That's trying to coordinate and guide these kind of responses and strategies, and which will eventually, hopefully, translate to national action plans. And so thank you for sort of placing the importance of how this can complement or work simultaneously with efforts on the ground. And I'm glad that you started touching on some of the strategies employed on a ground level, because I want to ask you, if youth are looking to better shape or be involved in conflict prevention efforts, what recommendations would you give them?
Well, I'll start with framing it, from the policy level. And, we look at the UN Security Council Resolution 2050 on youth, peace and security. And the resolution identifies 5 pillars of action to the positive role of youth in preventing violence and as active agents of peace building. And these pillars revolve around participation, protection, prevention, partnership, and disengagement. And this is very much, in line in terms of the work we do on youth, also in support of the African Union's Youth for Peace Africa program and initiatives. On our side, really, youth are central to our work as UNDP in Africa. We really want to go beyond talking about youth engagement and youth participation, but also looking at youth-led, initiatives, and engagements within this area of work. And, just to give some concrete, types of, examples, when we look at the risk factors in terms of recruitment, I mean, what we do see in the Africa region, that it is less around radicalization through online platforms. It's more, face-to-face, someone it's a peer or someone you trust within the community. But in terms of young people joining, young men, for example, predominantly join with friends, and young women tend to join with family. So on that front, in terms of, the work that we do, we really try to, also promote, and, this is an area where, youth can really take a leading action, is in terms of peer mentors, and also in terms of messaging, counter messaging, alternative messaging, that's there. And having this peer mentorship, which complements, more the hard elements, concrete, for example, livelihoods, opportunities, because there's also the element in terms of inclusion, hope for the future, that also needs to be nurtured. I mean, we've seen in some of our programs, for example, in Nigeria, that focuses on livelihoods, but has a strong component on citizen engagement and leadership, that 90% of the youth who had been part of that said that they felt they had hope for the future. So that is, I would say, really in terms of the peer-to-peer is really key. The other element is looking at youth's role in terms of strengthening conflict prevention, management, resolution, broadly speaking, at community level. We have in many countries well-established peace committees where youth are actively, involved in sort of broader peace building, early warning and early response mechanisms. So looking at, how to further strengthen the role of youth and in youth-led types of initiatives. So we've actually recently done a study on youth and peace building, and so also bringing, more of some of these protective factors and preventative factors from the traditional conflict prevention or conflict transformation field, into the PVE space. The other element is really, in terms of the social cohesion, at community level, and engagement, in local governance. I mean, we also see governance as an enabler. And so having the youth perspective and again promoting youth leadership within, for example, local governance can help, I'd say in terms of, trying to address particularly the preventative aspects of violent extremism.
Sure, thank you, Nirina. I am always amazed with how you manage to put forward such concrete and tangible and, just really useful recommendations in terms of knowing where to start as a young person who is wanting to make a difference in this particular issue on the continent. So thank you for that. And you started to talk about needing to give youth hope for the future, and I then want to end with that question for you. What gives you hope for the future and the work that you do?
Well, I think, what's interesting about working in the conflict prevention field, broadly speaking, is that you often see the worst effects of violent conflict. You see the worst effects of the impacts of violent extremism, but you also see what is being done, and you meet people who are committed, who are engaged, who are bringing their creativity, their ideas, their efforts, their energy into making a difference. And it's really premised on that and seeing how, these collective actions can make a bigger difference within these communities and at a larger scale. And on a personal level, really hearing also from individuals and seeing the difference that some of this work, has made, or, seeing them, in a way giving back and engaging, in some of these peace building activities. We've seen young people, for example, using their different skills, using photography as a catalyst for conversations around difficult issues. So based on, images that can be quite provocative, but using that as a tool to address some of these issues. Those who are using film, theater, the creativity, but hearing how this is changing the way people think about, an issue, identification, of the risks that people see. And, to go back to sort of the premise of the collective action and that this can really make a difference continues to give me hope and optimism for the future.
Thank you, Nirina, for such an enlightening conversation, and thank you for ending on a note such as that. And thank you to our viewers and listeners for joining us. I will remind you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Coffee with the Cord episode. Thank you, goodbye.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Coffee with a Cord. Do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can receive notifications every time we post a new episode. For more updates, like our Facebook page, African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, or follow us on Twitter or on Instagram at Accord Online. To learn more about Accord, visit our website www.accord.org.za.